Good morning, folks. Welcome back. Folks who are joining us from session one again. Welcome to the folks who are joining us for the first time. There were a couple of prerequisites that had to be met for this class. I hope you completed that using the shared videos and presentation material that I had sent over email. That's required for this class to continue. There's a command that I've pasted in chat. Make sure that you run the command and you see an output, right? And the output just describes the user whose credentials you're using to invoke that command. Okay, AWS STS get caller identity is the who am I equivalent of AWS. I'll skip this. I need you folks to, the new folks at least, please go through the online code of conduct that we have. And please remember that any violations will require me to evict you from the room. This is the general policy that we have for all online content that Cloud hosts and creates. Okay, with today's agenda, what we have is we're going to look at users, roles, and policies within AWS. I'll just give you a brief for the folks who are trying to understand this for the first time. I'll give you a brief overview of what users, roles, and policies mean, right, in different contexts within AWS and how they represent identities when you're accessing a resource. We'll also set up the labs. There are two labs for this session. One is more ClickOps. You'll be using the AWS console to figure out your answers, and the other one is all command driven. Both the labs are going to be set up using the AWS CLI commands, right? Which is why you need to make sure that your Masterclass profile is set up properly on your system. We're going to look at overprivileged users, some roles, and a misconfigured policy as a lab, right? And because we have a time constraint, we can't get into a lot of other misconfigurations that these identities would have. But we will get started with misconfigurations that we've commonly seen our customers also have and in the wild as well. And then eventually, at the end of the lab, at the end of the session, we're going to undo all the AWS changes we've created. As usual, I have a very rough diagram of what users and roles and tokens, how they interact within AWS. Again, lots of pieces are missing. This is heavily generalized. But remember that your client browser, when you're trying to log in into the AWS console, you're going to use the username and password combination. And the last week, you all created the Masterclass user. That username and password is what you use to log in into AWS console. So that's a user. Within AWS itself, remember you have different services. You have S3, EKS, SNS, SQS, right? SageMaker, doesn't matter. Whatever service you have, these services to interact with the rest of the AWS platform require you to have roles assigned to them, right? That's the function of what roles will give you. Users is for humans to work with AWS. Roles are for services to work within AWS, right? When you configure Masterclass user using the CLI last week, right, you use the access key and secret, okay, to interact with the AWS APIs. For a role to do the same thing, you'd work with an AWS access key, secret, and a token. A token is temporarily generated for a limited period of time, right, and this token expires. So every time you have an EC2 instance, for example, trying to interact with S3, right, EC2 instance to interact with S3 requires a role that is attached to EC2 to work with S3. There is also a lot of times we've seen there's also a bad practice amongst devs where they have users configured. Like imagine your Masterclass user. This user's access key and secret are then saved inside the source code, and this is what is used to interact with S3, which is a horrible practice because these are long-lived keys. In the case of a leakage, the attacker would have access to the AWS longer. And the best practice that AWS also recommends is to use a role that is attached to the EC2 instance with sufficient permissions to interact with S3. Okay. So just an overview of how users and policies, how they are shaped. Yeah, Dev, you've got a question?
Are you sharing
Oh. I have. Oh, super. Thanks, Dave. Folks, please, thank you, Dave. Please interject and let me know if you have any question. Just type it out, or if it's something as serious as the screen is not visibility, folks, then just let me know. Okay, this is the diagram I was talking to you about. You have your client browser using the username and password interacting with the rest of the AWS, and you have services within AWS like S3, SNS, SQS, right? EC2. All of these interacting with each other using roles, right? And how do you interact with each other with roles? You generate temporary tokens, right? Temporary credentials, and use these credentials to interact with the rest of the services. This is like an overview of what a policy looks like, because a policy is the basic building block of all permissions within AWS IAM, right? So you have users who are part of user groups. Users can exist outside of user groups as well, right? But it's highly recommended that users remain within groups, because it's easier to assign permissions to groups and then remove the permissions on the group itself. So you have users who can belong to multiple groups while the permissions are being assigned to the groups itself. You have users within groups, you have policies that are assigned to groups, and you have policies that can be assigned to roles as well. Okay. What a policy looks like is a policy contains a policy statement, right, in which there are permissions, and on the right hand side you'll see an example of a policy that I have. Essentially, the policy's name is what the SID is. Okay, it says allow EC to shut down. The effect of this policy when applied to a user is it allows this permission to be applicable. So what is the permission? The actions is EC2 stop instance and terminate instance in this case, right? So the user or the role to which this policy is attached would be able to stop or terminate instances. Now, what kind of instances, like which of these instances? You have resource which is star, which basically means all instances within AWS. You can specify the ARN of an EC2 instance here instead of providing star, right? But a lot of folks go with star because you would want to ensure continuity to other future resources that you create. The principle simply means that which resource is this assigned to, right? So you have username as an imaginary user within this imaginary account to which this policy is assigned. Now, condition is also an interesting part of policies. Most folks don't use this actively. Conditions allow you to restrict the usage of how policies exist. So in this case, an AWS source IP of the 192/24 CIDR would be this policy would be applicable only if the request is coming from this source IP address, right? And for the user to have a multi-factor authentication present, right? So MFA has to be enabled for the user to be able to shut down. That's what this policy means. Again, all these notes are going to be shared with you folks, so you can take a look at that. Let's quickly go and set up the lab that we have. But before we all get there, folks, please make sure that your AWS profile for Masterclass is set up. This is really important. Can you all confirm using thumbs up or yes in the chat? Okay, you all should all see that the Masterclass user is the current user, right? Simply because you're providing the hyphen profile. Last week we saw that you could also do an export, right? But let's work with profiles because some of you are not able to set up the environment variable. Okay. I'll just give you the link that's mentioned here. These are all AWS CLI commands. These are all AWS CLI commands that will set up some users. Specifically, these commands will create an IAM user with extra privileges, create a group, and an EC2 role, service role meant to perform limited RDS operations, but will have extra privileges. Any folks run these commands? Again, we're going to clean all of this up at the end, so don't worry. I'm creating them as well. If you get a 404 for that file that's mentioned in the text file.
Do we need to say that?
What's that?
Yes. Do we need to?
No, you don't need to. You don't need to. You don't need to. Yeah. The commands are AWS CLI is very self-explanatory when you take a look at the APIs that it is calling. The first command creates a user called S3 read user. I'm adding tags so that you can identify you're going to be browsing around. You have the second command attaches a user policy called S3 full access. Then there is another create user that creates another user, adds a user policy to it, creates a group, adds a group policy, and adds a user to the group. Right? Ignore this because I've added the trust policy directly into the command itself. So you can simply run this command. The trust policy is what the policy document JSON, the trust policy JSON is what is here JSON. So this creates a role called EC2 RDS read role and then attaches a bunch of role policies. Okay, let me know once you folks have created these resources. Yeah, if there's a 404, the file doesn't exist in the bucket. That's okay. Just skip that line, because what I've done is I've added the trust policy within the command itself. Let me know once you're done. Or the other way around. Let me know if anybody is still working on this. It's easier to track anyone who's still working on it. Anybody who's still running the commands?
Yes, I'm getting an error
Huh.
from the code.
Huh. Okay. Are you running them one by one?
Yes. Should I run all?
No, no, no. Run the commands one by one only. Are you getting this for the IAM create role? And are you on
Yes.
Windows? Are you on Windows?
Yes, sir.
Okay. I think that's the single quote, the double quote within the same bash command. Sorry, CMD is causing. Okay. Let me give you the. I'll just give you only for anyone who's getting an error with the create role for EC2 RDS. Let me just update that and give you on a command. There you go. Try this. Only for folks who are getting an error on create role. I've simply escaped the double quotes and replaced a single quote with a double quote. The rest of you folks, these are the questions you need to answer, right? The way you'll answer this, either use a CLI, which is a little more complicated at this time, because a bunch of us are not very familiar with the CLI. I would recommend logging into the AWS console, go to IAM, log into the AWS console, go to IAM, and try and answer questions. The first question is: a user called S3 read user appears to have extra privileges. Can you identify what these privileges are using the AWS console? So these exercises will build some familiarity with how the AWS console I'm sorry, how the AWS console has users, roles, and policies laid out. Okay? So a user called S3 read user appears to have extra privileges. The username is S3 read user, right? So think of what permissions are attached to this user that are going to make it have extra privileges. Okay, the name could have been anything. It could have been banana for all you care, right? But when I'm trying to create this scenario, I'm saying that there is a user called S3 read user, right? So think on those terms. the username has something to do with what privileges it is supposed to have. So for a user, what do we do is we go to users. If it's not come up here, you reload. You have S3 read user here. You click on that user and you look at permissions. Okay. From the name, S3 read user sounds like a user that is supposed to have only read access to S3. Okay. But when you expand the permission policy that is attached to this user, you see that the effect is allow, action is S3 on all actions, which means read, write, all of the actions that S3 can have. Read buckets, write buckets, read ACLs, read objects, read object ACLs, write object ACLs, all of those. And the S3 object lambda as well, that's a new resource in AWS, and all actions on this resource as well. And what resources? All resources. So this is basically Amazon S3 full access is an administrative permission on S3 as a service. Okay. So our user is called S3 read user. We're assuming this fellow is supposed to have only read access to S3, but we see that the policy that's assigned is to have all access to S3. That answers the first question. Folks, are you able to do this within your console? Great. Let's take a look at the next one. Can one of you tell me a user called EC2 describe only user has extra privileges because of a group assignment? Can you tell which group the user has been assigned to and what extra privileges this group gives it? As I said earlier, a user can exist without a group, but that's not recommended. Also, CIS compliance fails you if you have a user outside a group. It's recommended by AWS as well to have all users within groups, and then you assign permissions on the groups. But what you have here is a user. Yeah.
The group has an attached access, whereas the user only requires describe only user.
Great. Excellent. Go and take a quick look at that as well. Users. The AWS console is very intuitive. The word. If you've tried looking at the UI for Azure, for example, right, or Ali Cloud, you'll be lost even if you've browsed around for some time. So coming back to, you have EC2 describe only user, and you're right. The permissions that this user has are two policies: Amazon EC2 full access and Amazon EC2 read only access. If you notice, the attached via column will tell you that the read only access is assigned directly to the user, right? And there's a group called EC2 management users to which this user has been added to. Okay. Again, when you're doing CIS benchmarks as an audit on AWS to identify security issues, one of the flags that one of the checks that it does is to identify any users that have got any permissions that are directly attached. So it's a fail in terms of compliance. What you have here is a user who's clearly overprivileged. Good. Let's look at the last one. There is a role called EC2 read RDS read role. Can you tell what extra permissions this role has? Look at the EC2 RDS read role. Let's go back to IAM. On the left side, you have roles. You folks will have different roles listed here. But the EC2 RDS role okay, it's supposed to be an RDS role. Okay. So what does what's that?
EC2.
Yes, it has EC2 full access, right? It has IAM full access as well, and it has RDS full access. I'll tell you the problem with having a role with these permissions, right? When this role is attached to an EC2 instance, you create an EC2. We're going to do that in subsequent sessions, session 3 or 4, whenever we're doing EC2 instances. You will have a role that is attached to the EC2 instance. This is required so that EC2, as I said earlier, roles are used by services within AWS to interact with the rest of the AWS environment. So you have a role that is attached to EC2 because EC2 is a service within AWS. This role will give that EC2 instance the ability to do whatever the role has permissions for, right? Now imagine if the role has only S3 read access. The EC2 instance will be able to only read the contents of S3, like buckets and files. But in this case, EC2 has a role that's attached called EC2 RDS role. This role allows not only full access to other EC2 instances, but also IAM access and RDS full access, which means that if a user is able to gain access to this EC2 instance via SSRF, via shell, via command injection, doesn't matter, whatever application or network vulnerability you are able to gain access to, or the EC2 instance itself, you can generate temporary credentials that would give you access to the entire EC2 service and IAM as well. The interesting thing with IAM, right, full access, is that's a dangerous permission to have, is that you can use the role to create another user within IAM, give it administrator permissions, generate keys for that user, and become that user if you have IAM full access, right? Because IAM allows you to like essentially create and remove users. So you can create a user with administrator access policy and then become that user, right? Which is why IAM full access is something that should be immediately flagged for roles especially. Let's go back to our slide. Cool. Let's quickly set up lab 2 as well. Pasted the link in the chat here. Please make sure that you're running all of the commands with -- profile masterclass. We want these resources to be created within your masterclass profile. The commands in this text file: create an IAM policy that has limited permissions for IAM, right? Attaches a policy, attaches this policy to a new user that will obviously have only the permissions that are there in the policy, and then creates an access key and secret key. Okay, there are some instructions within the text file as well. Please follow them. What we are going to do in this lab is we are mimicking a user whose access key and secret has been leaked in the internet, right? Either through like a JS file or a GitHub repository or a paste bin. We're not going to do OSINT in this masterclass, but when I'm doing RDS, I'll show you some instances where information like access keys and secrets can be readily found on the internet. If you Google search or use other OSINT tools properly, you should be able to find access keys and secret for other users. But for now, let's go set up the lab that we have. Open the file. Well, after you run the second command,
Yes, same issue with
yeah, I'll give you. You're on Windows, right? So yeah. So folks who have run the second command, the create policy command, there's an ARN in the output. Okay? This is the ARN you need to provide to the rest of the commands where it says ARN from create policy. Okay, this is what I'm talking about. You need to provide this to the other commands wherever this is required.
The whole value, right?
Yeah. So I'll show you what I'm doing. So you have ARN here, so I'll just pick this ARN. This is it. And then I'm making sure I'm running in profile masterclass. Windows users, I'll just give you the create policy command. The command I'm pasting now in chat is only for Windows users. The others, please follow the instructions in the text file. Okay. I will created the access key.
Yeah.
Thumbs up, folks. Okay. Alright, so I have an access key and secret here. We are going to configure this using a new profile within our systems. So I'm just going to copy from here. We did this in session 1, and you folks should become really familiar with creating profiles. Every time we find stolen credentials, one of the earliest things you'll do as attackers okay, so you have a new profile that's created now. You can confirm this by calling wrong window. Okay, so I have AWS STS get caller identity. If you've enabled autocomplete, you can totally do autocomplete for the command. So I did get hyphen and then I did a tab and it completed the rest. Okay. You'll confirm you'll have a profile setup with Masterclass limited user. Excellent. Remember, every time you find keys, every time you find access key, secret, and tokens, you need to try and ensure that you've created a profile so that you can test work with it. Okay, just give me a second. निर्मला ये फैन ऑफ कर देना, रिकॉर्ड हो रहा है. फैन ऑफ कर, वो फैन ऑन कर दो. Okay. All right, so what we are going to do in this scenario is we have a role, we have a policy that has some permissions. All right, these permissions have now been attached to a user. The user is called limited user. Okay, this scenario exploits actual real world scenario from a pen test that we had done at AppSeco, the other company that I run. where we had identified a user with very limited privileges, but were able to escalate our access to an admin because the policy had certain functions, certain API calls that it allowed us to do, certain permissions that it allowed us to access. Okay, so this scenario exploits a user to perform privilege escalation in AWS. The assumption, as I said earlier, is these credentials that you just generated and added to your profile were found inside a JS file in an application penetration test. Okay, let's start with that assumption. Because we are all running this in your own individual AWS environments, we have to work with this assumption. The alternative was for me to create a user and give it to you, but then all of you would be beating down my account, which I wouldn't recommend sharing these credentials across different users. You work with your AWS account because we don't want AWS to block your accounts. All right, run an admin command like list users to see that the limited user has no access. Okay, can you folks do that? Run an admin command. AWS IAM list users is an administrative enough. I want to use the profile that I just created, Masterclass. Clearly, this user or limited user by name does not have access to running list users. Right? You get a very clear access denied error. So the next step is to identify what policies are attached to this user. Okay, I'm on step 2 here. Need a note of the command, so I'm just going to copy paste it. I'm trying to understand what policies are attached to this user. Okay? So there are two commands usually you'd want to run: list attached user policies and list attached policies. So there is a policy called policy version manager. This is the ARN of the policy, the Amazon resource number for this policy. So what we're going to do is we're going to identify the version of the identified policy that's currently active. Okay. Another thing about policies is that a policy can have different versions. Right? So up to 5 versions is supported by AWS for a policy. You can activate or deactivate certain versions. Right? Remember, the policies are basically a set of permissions. So imagine the same policy name can have different types of permissions based on the version that is currently active. Okay, so version 1 could have, say, S3 read access. Version 2 would have EC2 full access. Right? If you want to switch permissions for a user, you switch the version number of the policy that is currently active. Running the last command, AWS IAM get policy, will give us an idea of what version is active. We're going to do that now. I'm going to run get policy for that ARN, and you see the default version ID is v1. So we know v1 is active and applied to this user. Okay, because we saw earlier list user attached policies, list attached user policies, policy version manager is the name of the policy. If you look at the versions active, there's default version ID which is v1 that's been attached. You can also look at the attachment count. This will tell you how many resources the policy is attached to. Everybody is done till here? Identified that v1 is the policy. Okay. So once you've identified the version number of the policy, what we are going to do is we are going to look at the details of what the policy allows us to do. Okay, the command to do that is on screen here for step 4. AWS IAM get policy version hyphen policy ARN. Autocomplete is a gift here at this point in time. Hyphen version ID v1. Make sure that you're running in profile. Masterclass limited user. Masterclass. Excellent. This is the statement that is attached to the policy whose name is policy version manager. Can you folks tell me what actions this allows?
Attached to
Yeah,
you can get the work.
got it. So the user seems to have very limited IAM permissions, right? This user can't do anything else within AWS. If you notice, the user doesn't have access to S3, EC2, EKS, SNS, SQS, doesn't matter what service, no access. Within IAM also, this user has only 4 things that the user can do. The user can list user policies, the user can get the details of the policy, and the permissions that a policy version has, right? However, the last policy permission that this user has, called create policy version, allows the user to create another version of this policy. Like I said, you can have multiple versions for a policy and one is active at a time. So you can create another policy version, right, and see how you can change what permissions the policy has for that version that you'll create. That's what you're going to do here. One of the permissions attached is called IAM create policy version, right? If you see step 6, we can use this to create a new version of the attached policy with privileged access. Okay, this is a longer command, so I'm just going to paste it in chat here for you folks. For Windows users, I'll give you an alternate. This is for all Linux users, Linux Mac users. Read the command carefully and tell me what do you think it is doing. Yeah, but what is it doing? What's the command doing? It's creating a policy version. It's creating a new policy version, right? And the new policy version contains the statement allow action star resource star. Windows folks, here's the command for you. I sound very discriminatory at Windows people. No, it's not my fault. Windows doesn't recognize single quotes and double quotes properly, at least for CMD commands. PowerShell, I think, wouldn't have an issue with single quotes enclosing strings. CMD doesn't recognize stuff enclosed in single quotes. Anywho, coming back. So the command creates a new policy version, right? Replace the policy ARN with the ARN from the previous command and creates another policy version. There's an interesting switch in this command called set as default. Okay, there's a switch, if you notice, called set as default. It's very important because the policy actually lacks the ability to add the new policy version as a default. At So if you notice,
There's no additional permission required to set this policy version.
yeah. So if you notice, the only permissions that you have for this policy are list, get policy version, and create policy version. To attach or to change the version of a policy, you require set policy version also, right? If you notice, that permission is missing, but because your command for create policy version now supports -- set as default, you don't actually need that permission. You can actually create a new policy version, which is what you've done here using this policy document, and set this as the default for whatever resources are using this policy, right? In our case, limited user. So I have run this. We'll verify this. We'll verify both. We'll verify the version as well as we'll verify access. Now go ahead and run an administrative command. Right? We tried to do list users earlier. Poor chap had no access. Let's see. Now do we have? Excellent. We seem to have escalated our privileges. Everybody's reached till here. I'll show you the policy layout within AWS console. It's a little easier to visualize that way. Remember, you don't need the set policy version to apply this policy. All right, everyone seems to have reached here. So let me go switch back to the AWS console. Come back here. Go to users. Or the latest data. So limited user, if you notice,
Awesome.
yeah, you just hit the refresh button. All of the AWS console uses a lot of the same APIs that the CLI uses, a lot of undocumented APIs as well, right? So sometimes due to browser caching, the API call has not been updated here, data. Okay, so policy version is what we were working with, if you notice, and look at the permissions currently assigned to this policy, right? If you click on control click on that so that it opens a new tab on the policy name, it takes you to the policy description. And if you notice, you can go to policy versions. Do you see there are two versions? Version 1 was what was created and what was attached initially to the user. Version 2 is what you created because of the ability to create policy version, which was in version 1, right? Because of that ability to create a new policy version, you were able to create another version and make it the default in a single command. Okay. Now, some of you folks recognize this. The effect is allow action star resource star, right? Why I keep saying that, I mean, this is the most permissive AWS policy there is, and we can quickly take a look at permission as well. Let me just go to users and Masterclass. Do you see the administrator access policy that we attached last week? It's the same policy. So effect allow action star resource star is the administrator access managed policy by AWS. So you essentially made limited user into an admin user. Everyone's here? Cool. So in the command. Okay. I'm giving you the file to undo your changes. Please go ahead and undo the changes that we've done. Assuming that you all want to undo, I would recommend you all undo. If you all want to go back and practice a little more, take your time to see what access you all created, what users were created, what roles were created, then you don't have to run this now. I've added a couple of resources. There was an article I had written about using non-AWS workloads to access AWS services using IAM roles. Right? There is this new feature that was launched in AWS, I think last year, that is called Roles Anywhere. It's at the bottom here. This allows you to have a non-AWS machine. Imagine a machine running on GCP or Azure. To have you can manage that machine using IAM roles of AWS, right? So basically allowing AWS to work as if the machines are within AWS EC2, even if they're hosted on GCP and Azure. There was another webinar I had done on IAM privileges, so you can take a look at that as well. And this is the standard AWS reading room for users group and roles.
So I just wanted to process actually when you came across this credential, did you know that the set default is already there and you could play it, or did you figure out it kind of research or?
Okay, so good question there. Let me go back to the command prompt is going to be. For the other folks, I have a link pasted in chat for feedback. I'm required to ensure that I collect that from you folks. I missed it last week, so make sure that you please fill it. It's very short, but take 15 seconds. But coming back to your question is how did I know that, or what was the thought process I used to go actually through this set of commands to reach here, right? And how did I know that this would allow me to get access to here? So when we discovered this, and we keep discovering these time and again, the thing that is mentioned when you've identified an access key in secret, you'd want to try and see what permissions the username has at that point in time, right? And all of that is going to come through the permissions that are attached to the user. The list attached user policies is a first step that you take, because that's the way permissions are attached to the user, right? You'd enumerate what groups the user is in, because policies can be attached to the group also. You'd enumerate what IAM policies are attached to the user directly by using list attached user policies. Once you've identified those policies, you would then identify what the permissions are contained within that policy. Now remember, to do all of these, that policy itself needs to have the IAM permissions to list and get and do other things, right? In our case, for this particular example, the user that we were working with, that policy had these permissions. All right, it had actually IAM get policy, and then it had IAM anything with policy, right? And in one more case, we had an IAM star, which we didn't even need to do all of these things. We simply could enumerate and then create another user. We didn't have to do policy version creation, right? I could have simply created a new user and added administrator access policy to that user and become admin. But if you're going to follow this, then you have to look at what policies the current user has. It's the same as Windows or Linux, right? Once you've identified a user and you've got the password, you would want to see what privileges you have. So you do your whoami/priv, right, in Windows. You identify what policies are attached to either the group in which the user belongs or to the user directly. Enumerate the policies, so enumerate the permissions within that policy, okay? And then for that permission, that set of permissions, see what you can abuse. In our case, we had the access to create another policy version, which is why we went down this road. Imagine if you had EC2 start instance, right? Or if you had an S3 read write, right, to a bucket, you could change your attack path from there and go somewhere else. You get what I'm saying? Imagine if you had SSM, for example, for EC2. right? And if you had EC2 all access for this particular user, you would simply launch a new EC2 instance, right? Attach an admin role to the EC2, SSH into the EC2, use instance metadata to extract temporary credentials of the role that has admin privileges, and then become administrator. Okay, we are going to do this specific scenario that I mentioned. We are going to do this in the EC2 session, right? So make sure that you don't miss that. We are going to go from our admin role to an EC2 to AWS console access, right? No problem. There are tools obviously available, to be able to enumerate. Right? Most of these tools work with, like Prowler and Scout, for example. They focus on enumerating the access, not enumerating the access. Sorry, they focus on identifying whatever is misconfigured in terms of with the permissions that you have, right? So you are coming in as an auditor in that case, right? There are tools that are available that I'll answer that question, Anurag. There are tools available that allow you to enumerate, brute force all the APIs that AWS has to try and see which APIs will return true, right? Or which APIs will allow you to continue access with those credentials that you've just enumerated. Okay, and there are over 5,000 different API calls in AWS, right? I'm not sure of the number, but definitely over 5,000. The API calls for get, list, describe is what you would want to try and enumerate first, right? Because all the others require a lot more data. Like if you have a write, if you're trying to enumerate if a credential has write, right, then you require specific data that is required for that API. It's like doing a post request. You need to know the username, sorry, you need to know the name value parameters that you're going to make to the post request, right? So it's the same case with any write or delete or remove API permissions. So you want to do an enumeration of all permissions and then identify which ones do you have access to. I have a question here saying you said there are limited number of versions you can create. Yes, you can create 5. If that is already exhausted, then you switch to a policy version that is most likely going to get you access that needs you to elevate, right? Like in this case, imagine, where's my version number? Let me go to policy versions of the version that we have. The version 1 that we had was okay. I mean, it doesn't give you a lot of access except this create policy version that is dangerous. I was able to create another version with this. You can create up to 5 versions. Okay, and that's AWS's restriction. You can create up to 5 versions. Now 2 have been created. What if this was already exhausted, right? In that case, you enumerate the different versions of the policy. Remember in the command that we had a, yeah, right? So keep enumerating and see which one is the most likely to get you additional access. It's never as straightforward as 1 and 2. It's always 1, 2, and then you've leaked data from somewhere, you've got a username from somewhere, picked a bucket name from somewhere, a file from somewhere, yeah, things like that. Alright, that's all I had for session 2. Please make sure you all fill this short feedback before we end the class, and I will see you all next week. Okay, please make sure that you join again so that we have continuity over the classes. I will share the credentials for, sorry, I will share the slides for this class. I had at the end of this class, I'm going to share the